When I was a seminary student, there were two events that really caused me to think very pointedly about the relationships between Christians of various ethnicities. It was one thing to see events in the culture at large that made me question whether or not there were certain ethnic tensions, so to speak. Some would say racial tensions. I don't say that because there's only one race. The idea that there are multiple races is not a biblical idea. There is but one race. There are multiple ethnicities, but there is one race, all derived from the one man, Adam. You could possibly argue that there are two races, the race of the first Adam and the race of the last Adam, who are redeemed. But beyond that, there are no racial distinctions between human beings as far as biblical Christianity is concerned. But there's much ethnic strife, and one would assume that within the body of Christ you wouldn't see that, especially among seminarians. Two things happened. One was the Rodney King trial. And I remember, there were a lot of cameras in a lot of places on that day. And the news when the verdict came down, excuse me, not the Rodney King trial, but the OJ trial. Two things, Rodney King and OJ put together. News cameras when the verdicts came down, and the distinction between the response of black people and white people on both of those things was just amazing. For one of those, I was in the sort of common area, and I watched a group of seminarians have the exact same ethnic divergence in their response on verdict day that the rest of the culture at large did. White seminarians largely responding one way and black seminarians largely responding another. And I filed that away. Another event happened in 1995, and that was the Million Man March. Louis Farrakhan, leader of the Nation of Islam, called for a Million Man March. And a lot of people remember Million Man March, and that sounds familiar, the idea of a Million Man March. It was on October the 16th. So 2 days ago was the 18th anniversary of the Million Man March. But the Nation of Islam is not celebrating the anniversary of the, quote, Million Man March. They're celebrating the anniversary of a holy day of atonement, because that's what the Million Man March was called. A day of atonement for black men. Why was this significant for me during that period of my life? Louis Farrakhan, the head of the Nation of Islam, came to Houston, and he had a press conference in Houston leading up to the Million Man March. There were half a dozen or so black pastors in the Houston area who were standing shoulder to shoulder with Louis Farrakhan promoting the Million Man March. Now remember, the Million Man March was a day of atonement. Among these half a dozen black pastors who were standing with Louis Farrakhan, two of them I was in seminary with at the time. And one was the moderator of the then Union Baptist Association in the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, I have some knowledge of the Nation of Islam, so I'm conflicted. This is a problem. Number one, I was bothered by the fact that these men were standing shoulder to shoulder with Louis Farrakhan, promoting an event that Farrakhan was calling a Day of Atonement. Just straight blasphemy to the blood of Christ. And the second thing that really struck me were that my brothers in seminary of other ethnicities were confused. And on the one hand, they were disturbed because they said, why would these guys be standing with and uniting with Muslims on something called the Day of Atonement? But on the other hand, they immediately had that white guilt reaction. that says it's a black thing I must not understand. So the response was to not engage. Well, that sort of started me on a journey and on a quest to bring to light more information about the Nation of Islam, thinking, naive as I was, that if you just let people know what we're dealing with, then maybe we can make some headway in some of these issues. So that resulted in me turning my doctoral thesis in the direction of the Nation of Islam. The title of my doctoral thesis was A Critical Analysis of the History and Theology of the Nation of Islam with a View Toward an Effective Christian Response. It's boring. But since then, I've written a number of articles about it in more bite-sized pieces for other publications. And one of those I want to share with you tonight. I wrestled with how best to present this. I don't want you to think that I'm mocking the Nation of Islam. So there are a lot of quotes directly from Nation of Islam sources in this, because if I were to just tell you these are the things that these people believe, you would think that I was mocking the Nation of Islam. But I want you to keep this in mind. I want you to keep in mind that picture of half a dozen black pastors in Houston, Texas, standing shoulder to shoulder with Louis Farrakhan and other representatives of the Nation of Islam because they thought the Million Man March going to Washington for a national day of atonement for black men was a good idea for them and for their churches. And many of their brethren of other ethnicities, the overwhelming majorities, almost nobody took it upon themselves to challenge them on it because of this fear that we have. And it was wrong on both instances. So here we go.